Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this fourth webinar in the series of events we are organizing for our World Heritage in the month March, which is with the theme Genders and Diversities. A bit of practical information, as you can see on the screen. The spoken language of this event is English. We have live captions in English, which you can open with the CC icon in the bottom of your screen. And there will also be AI generated French captions via the link in the chat. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. And we very much welcome any questions, and we ask you to please put them in the Q&A box and not in the chat, so everyone can see your question and the speakers can respond to it. So this webinar, as I said, is the fourth in the series of webinars on diversities and genders as part of a whole year of our World Heritage 2021 debates, anticipating the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention in 2022. The previous webinars we had in this series are online, and you can check them via YouTube in case you missed them. We will also provide you some additional information on the conference that is still to come on the 29th and 30th of March next week at the end of this webinar. So with the theme Genders and Diversities, we seek to highlight the exclusionary practices and processes at play in World Heritage sites, as well as try to find and address new and innovative approaches to address those. To get involved in the wider conversation, you can use the hashtags and follow the accounts on your screen. And of course, as I said, you can pose questions in the Q&A. So today's topic is institutional inequalities and unequal power relations. And in particularly, we will look at how this impacts on diversity in World Heritage sites. We chose this topic because we feel it's really important to explicitly address power and power dynamics and the way they play out in reality and how it can be negotiated. We know that Unesco and the World Heritage Committee create structures in which World Heritage sites have to operate, and they thus ask for national and local policies, policy frameworks, but also policymakers and of course people in the field to fit within these structures, and local actors have to take it up on themselves to work with this, or maybe sometimes to resist them, which of course is not easy. Not only are these frameworks in themselves quite exclusive, because they frame heritage in very particular ways, and they require a lot of work and thus time of people, which then relates to who has this power, who has the capacity to develop the extensive statements of significance, for example, that are required, the management plans, and also other documents that you need to even become part of the World Heritage List. On the other hand, we know that once you are on this list, the World Heritage List and the World Heritage Committee meetings can be an international stage on which we can on which some of these local and national politics can be challenged publicly. In this webinar, we want to create space for our speakers to explore some of these issues around inequality and diversity, and how they are influenced by the institutional inequalities and unequal power relations created through these structures. I think we will hear from a really interesting range of speakers, all of whom move between governance, management, and more institutional structures and the academic world. This gives them a really interesting, and also it gives them multiple perspectives on the questions of inequality and diversity. We will hear from Dr. Kurt Lang. She is currently the director of the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg. Then we will be, she will be followed by Dr. Nut Lowe, who is the manager archaeology at the South African National Parks. Dr. Adewumi is a senior lecturer at the Department of Jurisprudence and International Law at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Kisić, who is a researcher, educator, and practitioner in heritage and museums based in Serbia. Then for the roundtable that will start around 4:15, we will be joined by Professor Sophia Labadi and Dr. Toki Latoan Brown for a conversation with the speakers. The event will then end. Of course, the timings here are UTC timings. The event will end around 5 British Standard Time or UTC. And if we choose to continue this, then we have to continue without captioning. The first speaker is Dr. Dikwo Winnie Kutlang, and I will introduce her a little bit more in detail, which I will do with every speaker once they are up. So she's currently the director of the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg and holds a Master of Science and a PhD in Paleoarchaeology in the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. She's a fossil primate specialist who conducts research in the Cradle of Humankind, which is also a World Heritage Site. She's a specialist of cultural resource management of paleo-related heritage and held various positions in public administration since 2006. For example, at the Town Skull World Heritage Site, the Vredefort Dome World Heritage Site, and the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site, as well as at the Department of Science and Technology in the Government of South Africa. She was the project manager in the development of the National Paleo Research Strategy and a champion of the transformation of paleo sciences. She is one of the first members of the Association of Southern African Professional Archaeology, who called for the formalization of transformation of archaeology, which then translated into the transformation charter of archaeology. And she may be able to tell us a little bit more about that later. In her current role, Dr. Kutlang is using her platform to train and mentor young African professionals in the sector with the ultimate aim of contributing towards material transformation of the paleo profession. To me, this sounds like an incredibly impressive CV and a lot of important work, and I very much look forward to your presentation, Winnie. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lois. I think good afternoon to everyone who's in my time zone. I know for others it must be either a morning or midnight, but greetings to everyone who's attended the seminar today, and thank you for being part of this. I'm going to share my screen, and I just have to declare upfront that I have issues with my connection, and I hope it does not disappoint. So I'm going to share right now. Can you just give me a second? So I'm sharing. Can everyone see my screen? I'm going to put it in.
Yes.
Is it clear? Is it visible?
For me, it is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for confirming. As it has been said, my name is Dikwo Winnie Kutlang. I am currently the director of the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. It is actually an honor for me to be invited to speak at this webinar. And I hope through this webinar, we will all work together to find some of the solutions to the problems that we see being presented by sites that have been ratified and included into the World Heritage List. And today I'm going to talk about the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site in South Africa. I just want to give a background to what I'm going to be discussing so that I don't want to take advantage of the fact that people might be aware of what is going on in South Africa or the background to the Cradle of Humankind and our involvement with UNESCO and World Heritage listings. As a whole lot of you might be aware, South Africa in the 70s was expelled from the UN as part of the pressure that the country faced against its apartheid policies. However, when we had our first elections in 1994, our first democratic elections where all adults of voting age were allowed to vote in 1994, we were readmitted into the UN. The photos, the pictures that I have here are some of the demonstrations. The one at the bottom demonstrates the long queues where people were very excited to be one of the first, especially when it comes to Black Africans who had their first opportunity to vote in a national democratic election. And post that, post the transition into a democratic South Africa, there was a lot of changes that took place in the country. In 1997, the country also ratified the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, and as we became also a member of the World Heritage Committee. Also during the same year, we had a huge discovery that that was announced in the country of South Africa's oldest fossil hominin in Sterkfontein, called Littlefoot, discovered by Professor Ron Clark, Nkwane Molefe, and Mr. Stephen Mutsumi. So there was a lot of changes within the heritage landscape. 2 years later, we adopted the World Heritage Convention Act of 1999 as a country. Also during the same year, the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site was inscribed into the World Heritage List alongside other World Heritage, other sites within the country. So in 1999, it was for the first time that we had sites that were inscribed into the World Heritage List. And also due to the transformation and the transitions that were happening at the time, and just a few years post our first entering into a democratic state, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of with regards to renewal of the country, renewal of the also feeding off to what has been going on in other parts of the continent. And it was also during this year that we had the seminal inaugural speech given by our then president Thabo Mbeki, who spoke of African Renaissance, who spoke of renewal as a continent, also basing these statements from the rich natural and cultural heritage that the continent has. And also the legal climate was changing alongside all these transformations that we saw. By that time, we already had adopted a new constitution as a country. The heritage resources, which were previously termed the national monuments, now fell under a new legislation called the National Heritage Resources Act, which was meant to be more inclusive of all different types of heritages that were previously not recognized by the National Monuments Act, which operated prior to 1994. By that time, we already had the World Heritage Convention Act, and also with the recognition that all this World Heritage needs to be protected beyond just the normal environmental management. There was now an inscription of the National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act in the same year. So you see that there was a lot of transition with regards to the legal climate relating to heritage management. The operational structures for all this heritage at the time and continuing up to the present day, they are managed by the National Department of Environmental Affairs of World Heritage Office, based in Pretoria, in the capital of the country, with some branches in Cape Town, in the Western Cape. We also have the South African Heritage Resources Agency with a head office in Cape Town and various regional offices within different provinces as well. But I want to talk about the process for this inscription and listing as a World Heritage Site, just from the start, when starting off with the site that requires nomination. When I was going through some of the gazetted documents about how do we go about nominating a World Heritage Site, it's clear, it's inclusive, it talks about, it provides for any person to submit a proposal in writing to the department, to the relevant department. In our case in South Africa, it will be the Department of Environmental Affairs in conjunction with SARA and its subsidiaries. And I want you to take note of this criteria that that I have in red. It can be any person who can submit, any person, so it's very inclusive, does not exclude anyone. The proposal has to be a proposal, and it has to be in writing. That is very formal. I think we are aware that that's formal. It has to be a proposal, it has to be in writing, it has to be at the department. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, those two departments that are the main departments. They're not the only departments that are involved in World Heritage Management, but the main departments for World Heritage Management based in Pretoria, based in Cape Town. I just want you to be aware of those two and take note for the upcoming slides. Just to give you a background, the Cradle of Humankind was nominated, was inscribed in 1999, when there were all these legislative transformations that were happening in the country, and also there were later editions that were added in 2005. So in 1999, if you can see on this image, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the Cradle of Humankind, which is based in the Gauteng province, which is where Johannesburg, I think most of you might be aware of Johannesburg and the capital Pretoria are located. The Cradle of Humankind, which consists of 13 fossil sites of archaeological and paleontological significance, were inscribed into the World Heritage Site, including one site in Limpopo province, which is called Makapans Valley, and also the Daunska World Heritage Site, which is in a different province in the northwest, the southern part of the Northwest province. So these sites were inscribed in 1999, and Etaung was added in 2005. Just to give you an indication of what the locality looks like, we have an interpretation center on the bottom left of the screen in the form of a tumulus. This is where the interpretation center is based within the Cradle of Humankind, right outside of Sterfontein Caves. And here we have orientations, and these are called orientation markers for the Cradle of Humankind. So these are the kinds of markers that you will see as you enter or exit the boundary of the Cradle of Humankind. I will talk more to what this significance of this imagery is. I have to apologize. I think I see a bit of something, but the issue right now is how is this heritage framed? We are aware, and it has been noted in literature, that it's not necessarily about a truthful representation, because there is no such when it comes to heritage, but mainly heritage is about deliverable objectives. It's about reinforcing social cohesion, construction of traditions, origin, identity, and morality. And this is by Harrison. And also, so basically heritage is not, there are no scientific facts when it comes to what heritage is. It's all about how a social construct. That is my understanding of what is trying to be mentioned here. And when you look at the outstanding universal value of the Cradle of Humankind, it has only mainly been based on natural and cultural significance, based on the fossil remains and archaeological remains. So mainly it's all the scientific value that the site holds. That is how it has been inscribed into the World Heritage List. That is what is represented. That is the significance that is most recognized. And these are entrenched by the World Heritage Committee, and also these are discrete by local structures. Remember, I spoke about the National Heritage Resources Act and how we promulgated the World Heritage Convention Act. So these were basically rubber stamped by local structures when we promulgated the World Heritage Convention Act. However, something that I even went back to look at the inscription again and see what kind of significances have been identified with the World Heritage Convention, with the World Heritage of the Cradle of Humankind. And I realized that when actually we're talking about all the significances, not all significances that have been identified by the local population have been incorporated as part of the significance and as part of this outstanding universal value that is now recognized globally for the Cradle of Humankind. I remember in a few years ago when I was doing a lot of field work for a private company in the Cradle of Humankind, you know, a lot of oral traditions exist about the area, about how it used to be an area of spiritual significance, whether it's traditional or religious significance, and even up to present day, you find a lot of practices of traditional and religious significance taking place around the area. And I want to raise this issue of having voices that exist within the heritage, World Heritage, but however, these voices, because of the systems and the structures, are being muted and they are not recognized as part of the overall universal value that is recognized by the World Heritage Committees or Convention. And I'm going to talk more in detail about that in the following slides. Just another context, the Cradle of Humankind, based in the Gauteng province, it lies within a localized area called the West Rand District Municipality. It's actually on the southwest portion of the Gauteng province. And the population here, and I just want you to note this, the population is characterized by males and females of almost equal numbers, However, the large majority is unemployed. We have 48% unemployment within that region, 48% unemployment, suggesting that almost half of the population there is unemployed. 34.6% share below, live below the poverty line. So basically the average person that lives within the region of the Cradle of Humankind is an unemployed, largely uneducated, Black African, because they constitute over 80% of the population within the country and within also the Western District Municipality, who actually lives below the poverty line. So I just want to note that. And this is just an indication of what the scenery looks like just as you drive outside. It's not actually what can do. As you drive outside the Cradle of Humankind, we have a lot of informal settlements surrounding the area. Actually, even within the Cradle, we have smaller sections of informal settlements made out of corrugated iron sheets. We have what we call our townships, which are areas which were previously designated for Black Africans. Some of them are not necessarily made out of corrugated iron sheets, but they're made of low-cost housing, which is not of the same caliber or quality from other parts of the privileged parts of the population. We have upmarket, upscale lifestyle estates just outside the boundaries of the Cradle of Humankind. We have businesses. This is actually Avianto wedding venue. It's an upmarket, upscale wedding venue, and you will see more of its images. So you can see the duality of socioeconomic realities of the people and the population that surround the Cradle of Humankind. We have and all of this, also be aware that they are divided along racial lines. In South Africa, you cannot remove economic status, socioeconomic status from race. Unfortunately, the legacy of apartheid still continues even today. And I just also want to go back to the history of nomination. You know, remember, according to the World Heritage Convention Act that we promulgated, it states that any individual is able to write a proposal in writing to the relevant department. But I want to take you back to the process when the World Heritage was going to, the World Heritage Site was being nominated, when the public participation process was happening. That was between 1997, 1998, 1999. I was still a young person then. I was still in high school. I didn't know anything about the Cradle of Humankind. I had never heard of it before during that time. However, people who were there, who are aware of what's going on, because it's difficult to actually find recorded data on the exact process, but you do get snippets of what happened. A group of scientists from the local Wits University, who are also part landowners in the Cradle of Humankind, in collaboration with landowners who are landowners in the Cradle of Humankind, government officials facilitated for the process of nomination. And so I just want you to be aware who are the leaders within this process of nomination for the World Heritage. University, a privileged university, previously white university within Johannesburg, landowners. And in South Africa, you might not be aware, but in South Africa, when we're talking about landowners, especially within land designated as farms within the Cradle of Humankind, because most of them are not actually farmland. These are previously advantaged individuals. These are your white landowners and government officials facilitated this process of nomination. And according to records, it is said that the consultation of other stakeholders happened. It happened with business, it happened with other government stakeholders and community leaders. And immediately it became clear to me that this is quite an exclusionary process, because this is not a holistic group of stakeholders. And also I want to talk about, with the inscription of this World Heritage, there was some negotiation that happened about how this heritage is going to be used and how it's going to benefit the region, not only the region, but the country as a whole. With the scientists, there was an argument for presentation and conservation of the heritage. Scientists are for the heritage and for its presentation and preservation. And then we had around the area, business people, landowners. In most cases, a lot of the landowners would be business people, but then it's not necessarily usually the same group of people. They argued for business development of the area. Also, there was a lot during that time. We had just entered into transitional government. You know, there was a lot of footing that the new administration needed to gain, and momentum also that they needed to gain with support, political support from the voters. So there was a rhetoric for economic development, for mass buy-in of the poor, Black, and educated residents of the region. So if you can see on the right, you see there's a government document that spoke to the benefits, the economic benefits that are going to be garnered from having this World Heritage listed as a World Heritage site. There was a company that was formed, not necessarily only for the development of the World Heritage as a part of the whole region, the province, for economic development. It was called Blue IQ. There was a lot of excitement at the time. I remember not only from just the business owners. Even though in the 1990s, I was still a child, but I remember when I entered the field in the year 2000, I had started hearing about all these economic initiatives that were already in plan, that are about to happen. You know, it really roused confidence as a South African in what the government was trying to do. Also, again, playing into political rhetoric. And seeing that heritage was now being used as a space for negotiation, and also there was just concentration as to what kinds of benefits are going to be garnered from this World Heritage site. But also, I just want you all to be aware that when it comes to South Africa, South Africa's history, it means all these groups that we are seeing here, they're actually divided along racial lines. We have the scientists, we have the business owners, we have all these different categories of interested, affected groups, stakeholders. They are mainly divided along racial lines. But also we see that this heritage was also an apparatus for staging national and international politics. Politics played a huge role and continues to play a huge role in the development of World Heritage internationally. You know, when it comes to rescinding or authorizing country status, this has a direct impact on the heritage. I mean, these sites were not included as part of World Heritage, but post 1994, with a new political change, so now inclusion as World Heritage status. Locally, you know, there was a lot of terminology around our origins based on what the finds that we've discovered within the area about our origins, about renewal, revival of the continent, and you know, bringing all those messages of hope, but using this heritage as a base for all this rhetoric that was going around the country, locally and in.
I think we might be suffering from Winnie's bad internet connection.
This is within Maropeng. It's one of the interpretation centers within the Cradle of Humankind. You know, invoking some images about burial, about origins, and you know, in African context. Although the tumulus is not necessarily an African concept, it's seen worldwide. Invoking images that talk to origins and burial and going back to your roots. Also, when you look at this stone. The stone Isivivane here, the Isivivane speaks to where we come from, where we're going, and us going back to our roots. So these are some of the imagery that have been played to use heritage as a apparatus for negotiating spaces, not only political, but socio-economically for gains. And I just want to... Yes.
Sorry, we are running a bit over time already. So can I ask you to wrap up?
Thank you. My apologies about that. But also some of the results that came with inscription of this World Heritage site, I want you to be aware. There was an increase in quantity of technicians. These are, when we're talking about technicians in South Africa, we're talking about those people within this World Heritage site context. We're talking about people who are at the grassroots, people who are the ones who are unearthing all these materials that are coming out of the ground. We have post 1994 and post the inscription into World Heritage, we had a large support for employment. However, as unskilled workers of these technicians, still as unskilled workers, these are taken from local communities, these are unskilled laborers. So, however, and also we had formalization of business associations within the area. There was a huge boom of businesses around the Cradle of Humankind. But what are the residual effects from that? I mean, at face value, you see employment being created, you see businesses being, however, what are the residual effects? You know, we are entrenching the use of unskilled labor, which is a practice that is based on its colonial apartheid roots. But also there's just a consolidation and protection of interests of some of the elite. I mean, with businesses growing in the area, with research increasing in the area, and who are the people who are conducting research? They are not your average person who lives within the cradle of humankind. And this slide also talks to that as well. But then Nduguyake Ndlovu, and I'm sure he's going to talk to that now, then he asked if heritage is being used to benefit a separate group and to the expense of another group, a different group of the population, then whose heritage is it? How do we frame this heritage in terms of the people who are participating within the development of this heritage, but they have seen no benefits? How do we frame it in terms of the people who are at the forefront of the research, who are the ones who are doing the nominations, who are the ones who are doing the inscriptions and assisting with stakeholders and running this heritage? Whose heritage is it? I really do not have an answer towards that. And I'm sure Nduguyake will elaborate more on this. But also, my argument is that World Heritage Convention and its structures, they act as a nexus for entrenching and perpetuating unequal power relations. I mean, I can go on and on about some of the examples that we have within the Cradle of Humankind that demonstrates the unequal power relations that have been brought about by enlisting of the site as a World Heritage. And what do we do with that? Do we have inclusive, equitable processes for identification, nomination, and operating? I mean, if you're saying any one person can write a proposal, who is any one person? Is that the illiterate, Black, African, poor, unemployed person who lives within the region? Can they write a formal proposal with ArcGIS maps, with cadastral maps, that you are actually excluding a large sector of the population from that? So, also we need to be aware that we need to start working with all the structures and transforming them to make sure that we protect the rights of all these voices that participated within this area, however, currently are actually acting as muted voices. Nobody is listening to their say within the Cradle of Humankind. My apologies for going over time. I just want to say thanks to Soramia, who was the first person to send me an email regarding the presentation, Lois, the organization itself, and please, if you are able to contact us, the following contact details. We are on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Winnie. That was so interesting, and it's so important, these questions of who inscribes, who benefits, who is represented, whose heritage is this, and it's exactly what we were hoping you would talk about. And it's so interesting, and at the same time, of course, very sad that this is so entrenched. And also thank you so much for your setup for the next speaker, who is of course also South African, Dr. Nduguyake Ndlovu is a manager in archaeology at the South African National Parks. This is a job he recently took up, as previously he was a senior lecturer in archaeology at the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he has a PhD, I learned yesterday, from Newcastle University, which is the university I am currently at. So that's a really nice link. Until recently, he was also editor-in-chief of the South African Archaeological Bulletin, and previously he served as a council member for the Association of Southern African Professional Archaeologists and the South African Archaeological Society. And he is currently the secretary for the World Archaeological Congress. His research focuses on Southern African rock art, heritage resource management, and the transformation in archaeology. So I'm very curious to find out how you find the new position. And also I can't wait to find out more about your work. The floor is yours.
Colleagues, thank you so much for the opportunity. As it has been mentioned, I'm Nduguyake Ndlovu, and indeed I do have a PhD from Newcastle. And just a little anecdote, when I first moved to Newcastle upon time, I used to think people in Newcastle do not speak English because I could not hear a word of the accent, but it took me some time, and I gelled into the city, and I began to understand what people were saying using their own accent of English. So thank you for the opportunity. Let me begin by just showing this photo, which I happen to be the one in the photo. And I'm using it because this is an image of the so-called, Rosetta Stone, which, led significant power to the inscription of Ukahlamba Drakensberg Park before it was extended a few years later. Well, a few years ago, rather, to form a World Heritage Site, together with Sehlabathebe, in Lesotho. And basically, as a prelude, to what I really want to talk about, today, I think it is critical to mention that amongst archaeological community, we have this idea that the concept of egalitarianism is deeply rooted amongst the Bushmen. And through this concept of egalitarianism, the idea is that, these people had equality among them, and they treated each other accordingly. But I will argue differently. And in contrast, I argue that this whole concept of equality for me is just a farce. Because inequality is a reality of life amongst all citizens of the world, and I could just add that this is the same phenomenon as our fingers, which are not equal. I would imagine how much difficult it would be if we had fingers of equal length and also facing the same in a direction, within our hands. It will be very difficult to hold anything with your confidence in our hands. So inequality, it's something that is deeply rooted in humanity. And I'm using that to say, we cannot therefore, when we argue that inequality is a description of life, we cannot expect that institutions that are established by human beings will reflect, any equality. I will argue that we should actually expect the contrast, such that these institutions will actually promote inequality, as Dr. Kleng has indicated also in her presentation just before me. So I'm wanting to review the use of international instruments, which are used to nominate and to deliberate, as well as to either inscribe or decline the invitation to inscribe any particular site into World Heritage. And I do so by critically reviewing two aspects. The first one I want to focus on are the concepts governing the World Heritage nomination, inscription, and so on. But also I want to focus on the governance structures for this World Heritage. Now, looking at the concepts behind World Heritage, one of the major two concepts are authenticity as well as integrity. And my argument here is that these concepts are actually very much physically oriented. And that is to the exclusion of intangible aspects of heritage, meaning that the spiritual potency and the spiritual significance of these sites is actually not given much regard. And just as a reflection to Dr. Kleng's presentation, she had in one of the slides an image of church members attending a church ceremony within the World Heritage Site. And that would not be an aspect considered to be of much significance, beyond the scientific, narrative that will be told as far as that World Heritage Site is concerned. So I am of the view that when you consider the concepts such as authenticity and integrity and their physical nature, this is actually happening because the practice of heritage management overall is largely Eurocentric. And therefore, to the experts, it made sense to focus on this, what you see, rather than focus intensively on what you feel when you go to a particular site. Now, I am further of the view that there have been attempts to correct, this, situation. And for example, we today can talk of the convention, for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. But I am saying, this balancing of legal instruments, is just for me an act, to be politically correct in terms of our approach to identification and inscription of heritage sites, but it's actually, still very much hostile, I will argue, to the spiritual aspects, behind the management of any, given site. And with heritage, sites for the purposes of this presentation. So my view further is that this balancing, what I call balancing instruments, as I say, are just politically correct actions to address, any unhappiness with the legal instruments that are used. So let me just give an example. For me, if you continue to use the 1972 convention, and you are actually deeply emphasizing the physical aspects of heritage in general, and to be more specific, also within the World Heritage community, and just adding an addendum of a 2003 convention doesn't go, far enough. So my view is that we need a complete review of legal instruments, and it is only through that that we can challenge these concepts of physically orientated approach to world heritage, and therefore we can begin to walk away from concepts like integrity and authenticity. I'm not of the view that these concepts are doing us any good, and I wouldn't want to go in much more details on that because I'm going to lose, time. Now, moving away from these concepts, which I consider to be, problematic, let me then focus on the governance structures, for the inscription as well as the management of world heritage sites. And we need to remember that UNESCO does not exist within a vacuum. Instead, UNESCO actually exists within a highly politicized entity that does not promote any equality whatsoever. And we know that because power within the United Nations is actually limited to only 5, I would say, so-called superpowers. It is what they say that goes. So we cannot therefore expect that with UNESCO's positions within the world that we live in, we can see any equality of some sort when it comes to how World Heritage sites are governed. And furthermore, I would say, it has been common practice that final decisions that are taken by the World Heritage Committee do not necessarily have to reflect the advice offered by advisory bodies. And that by itself is a confirmation that it is actually a lot more than scientific significance of the site that a site gets inscribed. And instead, it is diplomatic ties between countries which actually critically determine the outcome of the review process. Many years ago, in one of my employments previously held, I was once asked to attend on behalf of my boss at the time. I was asked to attend the meeting of the South African World Heritage Committee. And I remember arriving at the meeting and wondering why, we should have within the members attending the meeting, why we should have, staff members from the Department of Foreign Affairs. I, as a heritage practitioner, couldn't understand why they would be there. But over time, when their presence was explained, it became very clear to me that, they were there to assess what kind of assistance, diplomatic assistance they could offer as far as the applications that the country was forwarding, for consideration by the World Heritage Committee. So that clearly shows the highly politicized framework within which decisions are made. So if we accept that the United Nations itself is not a transformed, international body, why would we expect any form of equality in terms of how inscriptions are reviewed, in terms of how nominations are finally decided upon? If I could go further, I will also say that the highly politicized process of reviewing and inscribing sites that have been nominated, it's happening within a setup that promotes significant inequality. As a result, you will see that some sites have found their way into being inscribed when actually they do not deserve the status of World Heritage in my considered view. And without mentioning specific sites, I just want to make a strong argument to say, having had an opportunity to visit some French local sites that some of which are inscribed to World Heritage, that you have a clear evidence to say some sites are easily inscribed because of the geographical location where they are found, which also tells you about the political power the particular country has, as opposed to those countries that are from the so-called developing world, whose sites may not necessarily be treated in the same way as the sites from the West are. Now, in conclusion, I would therefore argue that the World Heritage Committee, as well as the legal instruments that are used to review all the nominated sites, cannot be immune to criticism. Instead, they should be heavily criticized because they promote the highly unequal power relations within the institutions that are tasked with the responsibility of managing these heritage resources. And in addition to that, I wish to argue that the institutions and their legal instruments are actually a reflection of our undivided and undemocratic society. And therefore, we cannot expect them to be any different. This is why, therefore, you continue to see that the representation of the so-called developing world is very minimal in the heritage committees. And also it goes to show why a country like South Africa would be able immediately post our democratic transition, will be able to amass so many sites on the World Heritage list when some other developing nations will not be in a position to do so. It is all because of the political power South Africa commanded immediately post its transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really good, and I think super important. I'm very curious, maybe it's more for the discussion than for now, but if you think it's even possible, this transformation or of these institutions, or maybe we should just abolish the whole thing. But I think I think we will skip the break, if that's okay with you, Dr. Adewumi, to continue with the presentation. Then we take some time back, so we keep some time for the conversation. So I will just briefly introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Adewumi, and she is a senior lecturer at the Department of Jurisprudence and International Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. She holds a PhD in cultural property law on the topic of return and restitution of cultural property in African states under the 1970s UNESCO and 1995 Unequal Conventions. She is a pioneer PhD holder in cultural property law in Nigeria. As a senior lecturer, she teaches cultural property law in the Nigerian legal system and private international law. She was a UniDroit scholar in 2014 and is a member of the Nigerian Bar Association, the Nigerian Association of Law Teachers, and the Association of Nigerian Archivists, the Commonwealth Legal Education Association. The Global Emergency Response Group, ICOMOS, and expert member for ICOMOS. She was also trained as a cultural heritage first aider by the Prince Claus Fonds and ICROM and the Smithsonian Institute, and has a heritage steward challenging circumstances in 2019. I think this is an incredibly impressive background, and I really look forward to learning more about you and your work. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Can you put the presentation on? Yeah, super. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Nigeria. I want to specially acknowledge Mr. Friday Awonusi of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments for his assistance and making available to me the conservation management plans of the World Heritage Sites. Today, I will be speaking on balancing inequalities among stakeholders through the participatory management system. Now, we're using case studies of Nigeria heritage sites. Nigeria became a signatory to the World Heritage Convention in 1974. And on the World Heritage List, Nigeria has 2 sites, which are the Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove and the Supracultural Landscape. Interestingly, these are the only 2 sites that enjoy the community-based protection alongside the protection that is offered by the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, amidst over 60 sites that are national monuments in Nigeria. The participatory management system relates to enhancing the relationship between cultural heritage institutions and professionals and everyone interested or engaged in cultural heritage, which are the civil societies, the public, the owners of the heritage, the caretakers, the businesses, tourists, and other stakeholders. The operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention has stipulated that state parties in charge of properties listed should put in place adequate long-term legislative, regulatory, institutional, or traditional protection and management to ensure their safeguarding, in addition to a management plan or documented management system. This provision can be referred to as a basis for balancing unequal power relations among the stakeholders in World Heritage Sites. The requirements of this provision are all contained in the conservation management plan of each site, which is reviewed every 5 years. So we have the Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove, which was declared a national monument in 1965. And in July 2005, the grove was listed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. The federal and state governments are the legal owners of all declared sites and monuments in Nigeria, while the communities exercise cultural rights. The Ataoja, who is the traditional custodian of the grove, holds it in trust for the Osogbo community and the Osun devotees. The National Commission for Museums and Monuments is vested by Decree 77 of 1979, with the custodianship of all monuments, shrines, antiquities in the territory of Nigeria. The Osun-Osogbo Sacred Group falls under the jurisdiction of Osogbo local government. The group possesses rich historical, traditional, and spiritual values, as well as artistic and architectural works of cultural significance. The group is the repository of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage of the people of Osogbo. The site is a symbol of traditional Yoruba religious practices among the Yoruba ethnic groups in Africa and even beyond Africa. The grove is also a natural herbal pharmacy, as it contains over 400 species of plants, out of which more than 200 species are highly medicinal, while some are endemic. Yearly, there is the Osun-Osogbo Festival that brings thousands of people from across the world. The site enjoys a participatory management system that cuts across the national, state, and local levels. At the national level, we have the federal government of Nigeria and the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. At the state level, we have the government of Osun State, on whose land or territory the grove is situate. Then we also have the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Osun State. At the local level, we have the king and his council, the Osogbo local government and the Olorunda local government areas. So the traditional status of the international status of the group is enlarged by the number of stakeholders involved in its management. So the traditional stakeholders cut across the king of Osogbo, the traditional chiefs, the priests and priestesses of Osun goddess, the priests and priestesses of all the other shrines that are found in the group, the Ifa divination practitioners, the Ogboni fraternity, the World Orisha Congress, the Osogbo community, traditional artists, and the Ifa devotees. Aside the traditional stakeholders, we have institutional stakeholders, which are the museums, which is the custodian of the site, the National Tourism Development Corporation, the Osun State Government, the Forestry Department, the two local governments that are in charge of the land mass, the National Orientation Agency, the Council for Arts and Culture, the National Gallery of Art, the National Environmental Standards Regulation, the Osun State Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the Osun State Art Council, the Osun State Tourism Board, and UNESCO. We have non-governmental organizations as stakeholders, and then we also have other stakeholders that cut across different higher institutions, secondary schools, and tour operators, tourists, and the Africans in diaspora. You know, the different stakeholders cut across the different values that the site has. Then the second World Heritage Site is the Supracultural Landscape. It is a living heritage located in the Adamawa State in the Mandara Mountains, which straddle the Nigeria and Cameroon borders. It is an ancient hilltop settlement with a rich history of iron technology, flourishing trade, strong political and cultural traditions. The landscape was declared a state monument in 1996. The Supracultural Landscape is the first of its kind inscribed on the World Heritage List in Africa in 1999. Sukro is an organically evolved landscape resulting from an initial social, economic, administrative, and/or religious imperative, and it has evolved to its present stage by association with and in response to its natural environment. So the landscape features a palace, ritual featured terrace fields decorated with dry stones and granites, which make the village setting so natural and exceptional. The landscape represents remarkable social, economic, political, and spiritual values, which continue to define the existence and relationship of the hilltop community. The intangible cultural attributes associated with festivals and ceremonies, belief systems, rituals, and taboos are indicative of the persistent social life that the landscape represents. The revered position of the Hidi as the political and spiritual head of the community is underscored by the magnificent dry stone architectural work that represents his palace, the terrace farming skills and the cattle fattening process, which is achieved through the construction of circular cattle pens, are contemporary examples of the ingenious use of local resources and adaptations to environment for subsistence and economic gain. So the management of the site is based on the dual system of traditional management system and modern management practice. The traditional management system is operated through the traditional authority of the chief and his council of titled men. The community's adherence to cultural norms, values, and respect for taboos aids the traditional management system and prohibits encroachment into sacred sites and enhance ritual observance. So the modern management system has principal stakeholders drawn from the public and private sectors. We have the federal government of Nigeria through the National Commission for Museums and Monuments as the custodian of the site. We have the Adamawa State Government, we have the Madagali Local Government Council, the Nigerian Natural Medicine Development Agency, the Sokro community, the Sokro neighbors, intergovernmental agencies like the UNDP, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and other relevant stakeholder agencies as the stakeholders. So how has it been possible to strike a balance between all these stakeholders on the World Heritage Sites located in Nigeria? This Osogbo Sacred Grove and the Supracultural Landscape have well-developed management plan that is adopted by all the stakeholders. The sites enjoy participatory management system between the community, the local government, and the national government. The federal government administers the sites through the site managers. The state government contributes through the local governments, the ministries, and the parastatals. The community's traditional responsibilities and cultural rights are exercised through the community head and his council of chiefs. Traditional laws, myths, taboos, and customs have been used to prevent encroachment on the sites. Traditional worshippers maintain the intangible heritage through spiritualism, worship, and symbolism. There's a management committee that consists of representatives of all stakeholders who implement policies, actions, and activities that are geared towards the sustainable development of the heritage sites. So with the participatory approach engaged by the stakeholders and documented in the conservation management plans, each stakeholder is aware of his or her responsibilities in relation to the conservation objectives. And this has made it possible to strike a balance between the stakeholders and also enhance accountability on the management of these sites. So in respect of other heritage sites in Nigeria that are not World Heritage Sites, we have several of them that have been declared monuments at the national level, the state level, and the community level. In the past, executive fiat was used in listing sites and as monuments in Nigeria, and the stakeholders were eliminated. So we find different heritage sites that were taken care of by the community or the family who are the owners of the heritage before the government took over the heritage and declared them as monuments. Because the sites were declared monuments through executive fiat, the stakeholders were eliminated or exempted. And so part of the integrity of the sites were lost due to lack of care. And then there will be power play when stakeholders are not properly constituted or carried along in site management. So Nigeria has several sites that are falling into disrepair after being declared as monuments because the stakeholders that should have been brought on board to assist with the management and protection of the sites with the federal government were eliminated, and that had led to several of them being destroyed. For example, we have the case of the Ilojo Bar, which is also referred to as the Ola Iya House. It was declared as a national monument in 1956 and has been under the management of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. Because the stakeholders that should have been carried along in protecting these sites were not carried along or properly constituted, the town planning authorities were not brought on board to take care of the monument. So because of development, urbanization, the private developer was able to get approval from the Lagos Planning Authority to pull down the site, and the site was pulled down. You can see the caterpillar pulling down the only remain of the Brazilian style technology in Lagos. But after the site was pulled down, the National Commission for Museums and Monuments was able to stop the development, but the damage had been done because the historic sites or monuments, architectural design, the last one left of the Brazilian style of architectural building design had been destroyed. So the challenges we're facing in Nigeria is that the National Commission for Museums and Monuments Act, which is outdated, and it doesn't have provisions nor subsidiary legislation for the adequate protection and preservation of these monuments that have been declared as national monuments, which has made it possible for many of them to fall into a state of disrepair, and some of them have even totally collapsed. Then we have the societal chain, whose links are based on the values of the society, have not been motivated because there's no legislation calling them to be stakeholders or bringing them on board. And this has led to a disregard of the nature of the Nigerian society and ultimately the collapse of these historic sites. So for heritage to be preserved, local managers are essential to be on board and to be carried along in the protection and conservation of these sites. There's also a lack of awareness and sensitization of the value of heritage among the stakeholders and the populace. This is what can account for the destruction and desecration of palaces and monuments in Nigeria, which took place last year during the EndSARS protest against police brutality. We find the palace of the Oba of Lagos, which was declared a national monument in 1969. It was destroyed by the youth when they were protesting against police brutality. They set the palace on fire, they desecrated the palace. You can see the picture of some of the youths running away with the staff of office of the Oba and some other sacred objects in the site. Assuming the youths have been educated about the value of heritage, they wouldn't have done this, because protesting against police brutality and desecrating heritage sites cannot just be linked together. So in conclusion, sustaining the cultural and natural heritage in Nigeria can only be feasible when international law, national law, and customary laws are harmonized. This is because local customs and practices form the bedrock of both local and universal values. Nigeria needs to develop a legal framework and legislation that gives priority to historic heritage. The legal framework must be such that harmonizes the World Heritage Convention with national laws as well as traditional systems. It is great to know that while we await the promulgation of a robust national law protecting heritage sites in Nigeria, Nigeria has moved from the era of listing sites through executive fiat to a participatory system where all the stakeholders are actively consulted before declaring monuments, and the roles to be played by all the stakeholders in the preservation and management of the sites are expressly spelled out and documented to eliminate power play. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Afolashade. That was so interesting. I kind of wonder, maybe some of these sites would not have collapsed if they were not made formally listed. Could be an interesting point for discussion later on. Next on our list of speakers, last but not least, is Višnja Kisić. She is a researcher, educator, and practitioner in the heritage and museums field, whose work focuses on relations between heritage, contemporary politics, and societal issues and identities. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Sports and Tourism in Novi Sad and at the Unesco Chair for Cultural Policy and Management in Belgrade. She's also a visiting professor at universities in Beijing, Lyon, and Casablanca. She has worked in several museums and has acted as Secretary General to Europa Nostra in Serbia, and has led projects, trainings, and lectures and research in over 20 countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. I've known and admired Višnja's work for quite a while. We are friends, I have to declare, of course. So I'm just looking forward to another very interesting talk. Višnja, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luz, and hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share the floor with all the other speakers, but also really thankful to all of you who have been creating such a relevant program and raising such relevant issues. So yeah, Merve and Paloma and Luz and Sofia and everyone else who is in the team. Okay, I'll share my screen and start with a presentation that will focus on the World Heritage as a framework for unequal power relations, but drawing insights from the World Heritage sites and some of the heritage struggles within the Balkans. Kind of traveling from Africa to the Balkans into a place or geographical location that can be called a semi-periphery. So these countries are all still developing countries, most of them countries which are republics or former republics of Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia that have been dissolved in quite a bloody war during the 90s. And that has created some sort of stage as well for some of the projects that I'm going to talk about and share, not all of them. But actually it was interesting when getting the invitation for this seminar in particular to be thinking about all the layers and all the nuances in which these unequal power relations that are built within the World Heritage as a framework and within UNESCO as a kind of organization really work out and play out. And it would be quite, I will be along the line with some of the previous speakers, basically starting with this fact that the very framework of World Heritage is, we could say first, not only kind of enhancing institutional inequalities that we have been seeing throughout all three presentations, and I will be referring to some of them, but goes much more deeper. So it perpetuates epistemic inequalities. So basically, it tells us what kind of knowledge, what kind of worldviews, what kind of futures we are able to see through heritage, and we are able to seek and frame through heritage. So the whole idea,
Sorry, is it possible to speak closer to the microphone, because we get some people asking this?
Yes, of course. Is it okay now?
For me, it's the same.
Okay. Let's
Maybe a bit closer to the computer.
Yeah. Or
sorry.
Maybe I just get my headphones and that. Okay, is it better now?
Much better.
Perfect. Okay. So so it's not only that World Heritage Framework actually perpetuates these institutional inequalities, and I'll be referring to some of them, but it's actually by really setting up very clear frameworks of what counts as heritage, what are the ways of governing, who has the right to nominate the site and through which procedures. It really perpetuates these kind of knowledge inequalities or very deep epistemic inequalities in terms of how we know about heritage, how we know about the world, how we relate to the past. And this is, I think, the biggest, kind of the deepest inequality of all that is embedded within the World Heritage as a framework. So this very mechanisms of universalizing ways of relating to heritage that throughout the world have been different in many different times, but have been basically, led through the same procedures and very same framework in terms of applying for the World Heritage status. So it is a particular genre that steers away all the other ways of relating to heritage. And I'll be giving some of examples when it comes to that. It also nationalizes efforts to protect heritage, quite paradoxically, because the idea of World Heritage has been there as this kind of global framework for, thinking about certain goods, certain traces of the past as globally relevant for the whole humanity. However, the very fact, and previous speakers have been mentioning this, that it is located within the United Nations, within UNESCO, and within basically member states that have the power stakes in this process, is something in which actually this methodological nationalism is being kind of cemented and perpetuated in every single nomination, but also in the way how sites are branded, how sites are protected. So these kind of power plays between the international and national really play out strongly within the World Heritage Framework. It also perpetuates global economic inequalities. And there's so many examples of participatory heritage management, involvement of different communities and stakeholders and so on and so forth. But all of that comes already with unequal power relations that are embedded in unequal power relations globally due to geopolitics, but also due to different forms of coloniality and different forms of economic and class inequalities, both on the local level, national level, and global level. And of course, one can't say that World Heritage Framework is causing these inequalities, but it is reflecting them and it is perpetuating them in terms of who actually profits from certain nominations, who has not only the say in terms of how something is valued, but really how economic value from that gets extracted and how it gets exploited. And it also reflects layers and layers of unequal power relations that are not only institutional. So there's unequal power relations between the member states, really geopolitics reflected within the UNESCO and World Heritage Framework. There's also unequal power relations between the national frameworks and the local frameworks, between heritage practitioners and the decision makers, not only within each single country, but also within the members of advisory structures within ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee, for example, as a power decision-making body. There's also layers of inequality among different professions that get involved within the heritage framework. And also this very fact that usually those who are studying World Heritage and who are doing the nominations, whether they are consultants imported from abroad or they are national experts, usually come from the centralized state institutions and really don't have to live with the consequences of what it means to become a World Heritage site and all the pressure that it takes. At the same time, I think it would be really unfair to say that World Heritage as a framework is only kind of cementing or reflecting or perpetuating already existing kind of power relations and inequalities, because on so many levels, it also acts as some sort of shaker of usual power relations. And in many cases, it actually counterbalances certain power relations of inequality within national and local heritage protection systems. So throughout the Western Balkans, national frameworks don't have such a clear focus on participation, multiculturalism, diversity, and so on and so forth, as they are obliged to do when they're nominating a site for the World Heritage as a framework. So a lot of actually participatory management structures are happening for the first time and in pioneering ways within the World Heritage nominations, not outside of them, and they're not being incorporated within the national frameworks. They're also, as a structure, encouraging interstate cooperation, as we'll see in one of the examples I want to mention. And in this case, interstate cooperation that wouldn't really happen
intentionally or voluntarily between the kind of neighboring countries in the Western Balkans. It also often imposes or encourages certain practices within heritage management that some of the kind of national management systems are not actually recognizing at all, such as the notions of cultural landscapes, such as the notions of transsectoral cooperation, participatory management, management plans for heritage, interpretation plans for heritage, which have been in many cases more useful tools than sticking to some of the national frameworks. And it also in so many ways serves as this kind of carrot and stick kind of mechanism for many of the local actors and heritage professionals when arguing for safeguarding heritage locally. So it also have this very, how to say, positive force in terms of counterbalancing certain power inequalities. And I'll move to some of the examples now. The first example I want to bring is the nomination of medieval gravestones called statues. That has been the nomination that is transnational, so shared between Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia, for countries that wouldn't cooperate otherwise, and that were cooperating officially within cultural diplomacy related to heritage only since the start of this very nomination. So there was the intention of Bosnia and Herzegovina to go by itself and nominate statues as their own national heritage. And the local or the regional UNESCO office intervened and advised that, well, this nomination wouldn't pass because this is a heritage that is shared across other kind of nation states that are neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina. And not only that this was the advice or sort of a warning that came from the position of power within UNESCO, but at the same time, UNESCO regional office in Sarajevo has put significant resources, money-wise, but also significant resources in terms of coordination of the 4 nation states and professionals from the 4 nation states. So doing quite a significant diplomatic effort, but also quite a significant kind of professional effort in terms of bringing these states together. More interestingly so, because this heritage has been appropriated by each of the 4 nation states for the purposes basically of claiming certain territories within Bosnia and beyond. So we are talking about medieval heritage where borders shift and they don't resemble the borders of the nation states today. But at the same time, each of the kind of nation states or specific interest communities are arguing that this is their heritage related to their ethnic community, their religious community, and so on and so forth. And through this kind of joint effort, there's also joint interpretation that has been made as a kind of consensual interpretation. And I'll write more about this in the book Governing Heritage Dissonance that is freely available online. But what is important here is that we see this role of UNESCO, or this power of UNESCO to bring together states that are trying to grab certain heritage resources for their own nationalistic purposes. At the same time, the power or the willingness of UNESCO to engage more deeply into intercultural and interreligious dialogue in the region is not there, because there's always this balancing between the interests and basically boundaries of the nation states and this kind of reconciliation mechanism that the World Heritage in this particular case represents. So when you go throughout the region and visit these sites today, you will see that each of the nation states has been sticking to their own interpretation, not actually following the joint interpretation that has been put forward within the nomination. And this has to do also with what one of the previous speakers has mentioned, and that is really the focus and perspective on physical aspects of heritage sites, their integrity and authenticity, and not so much on the interpretation and kind of presentation, education, and mediation related to World Heritage. The second case that I would like to bring up is the case that is still on the tentative list and that I'm currently working on towards the nomination together with many other colleagues. And that's the cultural landscape of Bač in the north of Serbia, in Vojvodina province, which is famous for its kind of multiculturalism and more than 20 different language and ethnic communities living in this region. At the same time, it's really interesting to observe how the perspectives and professional practices have changed throughout the years when it comes to this nomination. So how, because of the nomination for UNESCO, there's more and more participatory practices being introduced, but also there's much more kind of intersectoral cooperation being taken into account instead of just cherry picking certain heritage sites and certain natural heritage sites to be represented in this nomination. It's also interesting to see how the very notion of cultural landscape allows for certain things, but also how it embeds certain understandings. For example, this relationship between man and environment, which if you want to account for the presence of more than human world and this interrelationship between, you know, the usual categories of mind and body and culture and nature as divided or as on the opposite sides. It's really hard to find examples and to find the language, basically to find the kind of epistemic things that, that would support the very process of nomination writing. The third example, and I'll finish with this one, is the example that is not of the site that is on the tentative list within the frontiers of the Roman Empire. That is, again, a transnational nomination involving many states from UK all the way to Turkey and potentially North Africa. But actually, in this case of Belgrade Fortress as one of those sites that are to be nominated as part of the frontiers of Roman Empire, in 2009, there's been, since 2009 up until today, there's been a huge mobilization of professional communities and citizens and different activist groups to stop the cable car project building on the Belgrade Fortress, which would destroy the fortress in its numerous aspects. But basically the fight with the kind of political elites and the economic elites of the country, in which this very argument that Belgrade Fortress is potentially a UNESCO World Heritage Site has really been something that has shaped these relations of power when it comes to presence in media, because this is something that media would report on and would understand. It also shaped the understanding of citizens, because this is something that is very important for decision makers. And so many more people know what it means to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site than kind of recognizing the aspects of the local values of particular heritage. And today we have been actually celebrating the decision by the court to abandon this project and to announce that it is illegal. I might leave this one for the conversation later on, but to conclude with, so there's so many aspects within World Heritage that I think should be changed, but at the same time, a lot of those aspects are really the reflection on much, much larger power relations, economic, geopolitical, epistemological, gender-wise, and all the other unequal power relations that we see in the world today. So the call really for changing the World Heritage Framework is always the call for changing the world as it is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Višnja. And yeah, absolutely. And it was also good to hear some cases where the World Heritage structures were used maybe to fight the national structures a little bit, as also, of course, we saw in some of the other presentations. So I propose our speakers all open their cameras and their microphones, so we can also introduce Professor Sophia Labadi and Dr. Toki Latau-Brown for another, let's say, more or less 30 minutes of conversation between the speakers. But also, if there are, of course, questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A box so we can put them towards the speakers. Mention if there is a particular speaker you would like to address, or if this is to everyone. Welcome, Sophia. Welcome, Toki. And welcome back to our other speakers. I thought maybe I should start by asking if one of the speakers has a question for any of the other speakers, because they all spoke really nicely to each other, the presentation. So I can imagine you may have a question or a comment to each other. No? Yeah, please go. I was gonna.
No, there's so much to ask. Yeah. I think we should schedule another meeting to discuss all the things.
Well, then maybe we can have Sophia and Toki have maybe questions, or yeah, everyone just open your microphone and we can just have a conversation. It's okay.
Well, thank you very much, all of the speakers. That was a fascinating webinar, our last webinar of the month, but don't forget our conference next week on the 29th and 30th. I want to maybe start with a question on what Višnja just said about we need to change everything. How would you start? There's lots of movement for change at the moment, where we see that with, you know, the Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. And I think we've had a webinar on, you know, sexual violence, and we heard about, you know, the fact that there's lots of reproduction of neocolonial violence, particularly at work-related sites as concerned genders. You know, Black Lives Matter, etc. So would you see this as a way to start changing things, and how would you go about that? Maybe Višnja, this is just to follow up on what you were saying.
Yeah, so I would say, well, I'm really glad to see all those different movements popping out or continuing across the world. And I would say that there's no one mechanism that is good, that kind of each of us is responsible within their own kind of field of responsibility and practice, and you know, the privilege and power that we have, like each of us as lecturers, as heritage professionals, but also as citizens, humans of this world, to really, whenever there is the opportunity, always practice this kind of method of equality. And I think for me, it was really kind of what means a lot as a kind of framework for thought is the way Jacques Rancière writes about equality, not as something to be achieved, you know, not as a vision that we have to strive for, because that means kind of perpetuating inequality in everything we do in order to one day reach the equality, but that every time that we are in situation of power, we treat others as equals. So that it's this kind of method of equality that actually kind of moves forward. And that means, I think, criticizing everything that is not in line with that, but also trying to find out mechanisms that are being really informed about all those different movements, being informed about different writings that come from, you know, from economy to ecological thought to feminist studies and studies of coloniality and so on and so forth. And that really kind of, we don't give up any of the frameworks which exist, but try to change them. And then, well, always also do something alternatively on the other side in the case that we can't change the framework. So yeah, that's my view.
a question also for Višnja. When she was talking with her on her presentation, you spoke about how your World Heritage Convention not necessarily entrenches unequal power relations, and you spoke of how in some cases what you observe is that it has challenged the legislative framework that are non-inclusive, that maybe also be based on the kind of society that you were using and as an example. So how do you think it has?
Maybe we lost her there for a bit. Let's see.
In our situation in South Africa, it is actually, in my perception, when I look at all the World Heritage sites that we have currently that have been inscripted, I would say, because South Africa has some of the most democratic, inclusive legislations you can find in the world. I mean, we are lauded for that, but I don't see how World Heritage has not entrenched some of the societal inequalities that we have. So I wanted to ask you, from your perception, how have those how has the challenge that World Heritage Convention, how has it been received, and has it been a positive change that you've seen with the inscription of these sites into World Heritage?
So I would say that this is not by kind of by rule, that by implementing or by nominating the site on World Heritage List, kind of certain power dynamics are being changed. And it's so in so many of the cases, and I would say in all the cases that we have now inscribed, for example, in Serbia, this is the case, the very same thing that you are talking about. But at the same time, I'm also now, for example, involved in this process of cultural landscape in Baj, so this nomination. And there in particular, there are certain things that kind of are being challenged in terms of how development is being seen, and whether it's seen as, you know, big investments, multinational, and from the centers of power coming to this kind of very well, border region of Serbia that is one of the poorest areas in Serbia, or this is, or we are kind of pushing for certain things such as degrowth and what that would mean in the area that is really based on kind of rural supplies and subsistence economy and so on and so forth. So it's kind of whether we foster this image that usually comes with World Heritage, and that is mass tourism, more economic development, you know, internationalization, or we try to really not only safeguard, but even kind of go back to certain kind of relations and values, to cooperatives, for example. But that requires really not dealing only with the universal, outstanding universal value and, you know, the kind of cultural layers, but really dealing deeply with the agricultural layers, economic layers, and so on and so forth, kind of fighting investor-based urbanism, those sorts of things. And I won't say that this is kind of, this is due to World Heritage as such, but that World Heritage is for us some sort of excuse or kind of a joker in a way to play around and advocate for those ideas. And I don't know whether and to what extent that will be successful.
Do you think that the perception of all stakeholders, so I'm just addressing the floor right now. So do you think the perception of stakeholders affects how nomination sites are inscribed? So there will be certain types of people with stakeholders who will push for a particular site. So you'll have the business people push, you'll have the government push, but they all seem to be pushing a Eurocentric type of identity. So the site needs to look like that. So do you find that there's a power struggle when sites are being pushed to be on the tentative list? Anyone?
I'm going to respond in terms of well, my experience, what we see in South Africa, and most of it is based on what I see in the Cradle of Humankind. The push will always run in favor of the dominant groups, the dominant powerful groups. In South Africa, what I've observed is that there's always a push, and the dominant group, which is not necessarily the majority of the population, not necessarily the majority of the people within those areas or within the country, but the people with the socio-economic they are the ones who, the push will usually be in favor. You know, when you're talking about a site like the Cradle of Humankind, you see that the push has mainly been on what the scientist has advocated for when it comes to the inscription of these sites. You know, that's why between my presentation and what Dr. Nduguyake has said also, that, you know, there are other values that have not been recognized within these sites. And the push was for scientific value because it was the scientists, it was the landowners, it was a certain sector of society that was not necessarily advocating for other people's perception of the site, but mainly their own interests. So I really feel like the push is mainly in South African sites. What we saw was, when it comes to the inscription into the nomination, it was mainly based on what people with the socio-economic power have advocated for when it comes to this nomination and inscriptions of the sites. And it was mainly, when you look at a site like a Cradle, it was on the scientific value. That is what the focus was on, to the exclusion of the other values that have been identified by other groups that are around the areas that are within the country.
Just, if I can add to this, because that was a nomination in 1999, do you see a change now, like in 2021, or is it still very similar?
It's very similar, unfortunately, and it could be my own pessimistic view. It could be my own pessimistic view because there hasn't been studies on how perceptions of heritage or the World Heritage Convention, the impact has been. There hasn't been any formal studies, but in my perception and in my experience, unfortunately, it has still remained the same from what has happened in 1990. How this World Heritage is managed. So in my perception, and I don't know whether Dr. Ndlovu, if you feel like there has been change. There are some pushbacks. There's always going to be pushbacks in every society where there's injustices that are perceived, but I feel like the status quo remains.
Yeah, if I could jump in here quickly. I fully concur with you, Dr. Rotlang, because for me, and this is an argument I've come to make over the past few years. For me, you know, World Heritage inscription is just a status that people with economic and political power then use, you know, for their own benefits. What do I mean by that? If we look at this case study that has been South African case study that has been discussed, you know, today, the Cradle. Let's go back to even before it becomes internationally important. In her last slides, you know, she showed Dr. Rotlang showed an image of Professor Ron Clark together with the two, technicians, and Dr. Mutsumi, I forgot the second one. The name of the second one, who helped, you know, to discover the site. So when you look at just a team of these three people, whose life has become better, you know, many years later, you know, and it goes without saying that, you know, the technician's life has not changed whatsoever, economically, you know, academically, politically, or otherwise. But equally, you cannot say the same thing about Professor Clark. In this regard, and you take it further and you use those findings as a critical, you know, data that gets the sites inscribed, and yet you smell poverty, you see poverty on the immediate, you know, surroundings, and there's no one with any responsibility to say, how do we change that so that these people see the value of heritage, and heritage does not become just an elite, you know, aspect of life. I mean, do you expect me to be bothered about a significance of Stekfontein when I don't know when my next meal is going to come from. I would not be. And lastly, as academics, we are also to blame here, because when we drum up the support to tick the boxes for World Heritage Committee, we want to tick the boxes, social consultation happen. But even that by itself is a problem. When you are consulting with someone, you're not necessarily engaging with them. You are consulting them to take a box and say, I came and told you this site is being nominated for this thing that you don't even know about, but I'm such a gentleman, I'm going to explain to you that this is a concept called World Heritage, and it's going to bring millions of people, to this landscape, and you'll make money, and you'll all be good. None of the World Heritage sites in South Africa has significantly changed the lives of people. And yet the people who have benefited the more are those who will afford to put up a hotel nearby, and the commoners will remain cleaners and security officers. So even if they get a job, they get a low paying job. And that cannot be defined as a meaningful benefit. So you see this deeply entrenched inequality, therefore, that is actually far more emphasized by these instruments of UNESCO in the name of World Heritage. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, because it's a really important point, and actually maybe also brings me back a bit to the question I had after your presentation, Dr. Novi. That, like, is it still worth it to engage with UNESCO, or should you just refuse the whole World Heritage system? Should we abolish it? Or because I wonder, like, is it possible to change it to an extent that you can eradicate this racism, eradicate these inequalities, these structural issues within that system?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, let me start by giving an example from Eswatini. I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was having an intense debate with a colleague of mine from that country. And the argument was over Ngwenya mines. And the whole issue was about this site having been on a tentative list with a view of it being nominated for inscription into the World Heritage. And the difficulty here is that Eswatini, being one of the I would say economically weaker countries, they see mining around the site as an economic viability for the livelihood of its population. Now you see a conflict, therefore, because there are those who say no mining because this is a potential World Heritage site, and others are saying we need mining because we need economic power to be given to people. And what you see, therefore, is an use of these legal instruments whereby practitioners will fly into Eswatini, offer advice and say, if you want World Heritage, you cannot do 1, 2, 3, and 4, which benefits the men in the street. And you will have this site inscribed into World Heritage. And then what? So what? What changes for the person down the road? Nothing. So in addition, I am of the strong view that developing countries have ended up fighting the battle of numbers. So we will say, as Africa, we don't have many sites on the list. So we fight a battle of numbers, where the African World Heritage Fund is there to provide funding so that we can have more sites on the list. Okay, if we get 100 inscribed next year, what changes? Meaningfully, nothing. In addition to that, now I have called in my presentation for a complete overhaul of the system, because as long as you are trying to apply, a cement on the cracks, the cracks are still showing. What do I mean by that? South Africa, for example, and Dr. Hoteng used made this point earlier. we have our National Heritage Resources Act. It was passed 5 years after the transition to the so-called democratic in South Africa. So now when you look at just that piece of legislation, you should argue that because it was passed in a democratic era, it should be democratic, but it's not. It is almost a copy and paste approach of the 1969 legislation, because the framework of thinking has not been completely overhauled. Yeah, now you can see public consultation, which was not there in the 1969 legislation, but the ideological framework that actually is used to manage heritage has not changed, and the same applies to World Heritage, Convention and all the other, conventions. In my view, the whole ideology needs to be overhauled so that we completely revise, the concept of heritage, and we look at the concepts that we use. I spoke about authenticity and integrity. So when you look at authenticity, the view is you need to have a benchmark from which you say something is authentic and something is not authentic. So what benchmark do we use? When we go to site A, which is a beautiful rock art site, what benchmark are you using, to say this site can be inscribed, this site cannot be inscribed into the world? So all of this, in my view, respectfully, we need a significant overhaul of the system. Thank you.
In the meantime, we have received a few questions from the audience. I see that already Dr. Adewumi is answering the question that is a bit more technical typing. So maybe I'll read out the question that is by Lisa Ravna Vinbok. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Who asks, for some time now, many communities and cultures have worked to include aspects of their intangible cultural heritage on the list. Mostly, the idea is that such inscription will attach international words to practices and cultural expressions. In many cases, we see is that inscriptions actually work to cement intangible qualities, making them static and deny change. My question is for all participants: is there a way in which cultures that have experienced colonization, epistemicide, I don't know how to pronounce this properly, sorry, and other interruptions may add value to internationally to the intangible cultural heritage, but without categorizing as static with the present structures of world heritage? It's quite a question. You can read it in the Q&A. I don't know if someone wants to respond to this.
Yeah, I was reading it kind of along you reading it. So, and there's a really interesting moment that came to my mind with reading this question from the experience in Quibdó in Colombia, from this Chocó region that is inhabited mainly by Afro-Colombians, the poorest region in Colombia, where kind of on the paper they fought to have this kind of recognition of multicultural state and multinational state in a way, so that their identities are being recognized. But in one of those seminars, there is a person who have been claiming that, well, kind of this idea that you will be kind of provided a cultural center to display your cultural diversity traces in order for the state to claim that it is a multicultural state is just not what happens when you want to really deeply kind of care about certain cultures. And for them, it was really about kind of recognizing and safeguarding and not extracting from their life territories. That means like all the kind of ecological and life-sustaining network that they are in relationship with and that they practice has to be kind of in place and continuously evolving and alive and vibrating. And then when you really compare this to the intangible heritage list, it's really what it does for many endangered cultures. It's, really erasing all those kind of life territory places, the relations and all of that, and safeguarding only these traces basically of values, of practices that are dislocated, deterritorialized. So yeah, I would say we need to, if we want to protect something really deeply, holistically, that has to be ingrained in all the different layers of, of life and relation towards certain places and different peoples. Yeah, otherwise, it's really just a list.
I want to go back to the question regarding whether we avoid or we completely throw out regulations like the World Heritage Convention Act, and especially when you look at, my perception is that the international community and structures such as UNESCO, structures such as the World Heritage Convention, e-commerce, all of those, they serve as a mirror. They serve for countries to reflect on how they practice, whether their heritage, how their own practices. So they serve as a mirror for us to look at how is it that we are doing against our peers, irrespective of whether these are developing countries, irrespective of whether these are developed countries. And the issue of saying that the World Heritage Convention does not necessarily serve its purpose when it comes to some countries, it's for me, I feel like in societies such as South Africa is a highly unequal, is one of the most highly unequal societies in the world. And to bring in structures such as the World Heritage Convention and hope that such structures will come in and remedy some of the socio-economic ills that we have in a country is quite disingenuous, because you cannot expect an international body of that stature to come into a country and remedy some of this ingrained ills that we have in the country. And I think some of the problems that we see also relate to disingenuity when it comes to engagement with the public. There's a lot of disingenuity when it comes to our leadership, and in all its forms, not just political leadership. I'm also talking about our scientific leaders. I'm talking about our community leaders. There's a lot of disingenuity in engagement. You know, there's I don't know if I'm still on. Sorry, I think I lost you all there for a minute. Sorry about that. I have an unstable connection. So what I was saying is that there's a lot of disingenuity when it comes to engagement. Like Dr. Ndlubuaki said, you know, it's all about public participation, but there is engagement falls away when it comes to that public participation. And there is a lot of, it's all about political gain. It's all about scientific gain. It's all about, you know, ensuring our small interests are protected. And really, to be honest, in my perception, the World Heritage Convention, the acts associated with it are not necessarily flawed, but we need to use those as a reflection, as a mirror for our issues, our social ills that we have. Those needs to come on as a mirror to ourselves, and to see how we can utilize them to solve our own issues. But I don't think incorporating those into a society like ours would be the magic remedy to what issues we have in the country. And also what is going on with the heritage in this country is a direct reflection of the kind of society that we live in. You know, the racial divide, you know, the unequal access to resources, it's inherent within the country. Legacy of apartheid, it continues within the current century, and it will probably continue for centuries to come. But I don't think we should just throw out the baby with the bathwater. World Heritage Conventions are there for a reason. They are adopted by this number of countries for a reason, and they are accepted by so many countries, so many democratic countries for a reason. And we need to reflect back on ourselves as to what is it that we are doing to ensure that we utilize these resources that are brought, these resources and these frameworks that are brought in by the international community for the greater benefit, and not necessarily for the benefit of the few elite that currently have access to these resources.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah.
I want to say that in nominating heritage sites, a lot has to do with the national government, because it is each country that will push for nomination. And for any site to be nominated, it first has to be a national site in that particular country. There is no way a site will end up as a World Heritage site without having experts from the advisory bodies of UNESCO, or foreign experts on different aspects of heritage coming in to look at the heritage and assess it. And there are times when, well, there might be a particular value that even the national government did not have had their minds to, that it is the foreign experts that will now pick such. So I think, well, as for me, I think the World Heritage Convention has actually brought about a lot of improvement on the way our heritage sites are managed in Nigeria. Because locally, we have learned a lot from the criteria for listing, which, like I said in my presentation, we are actually putting into play concerning other sites that are not yet World Heritage sites, like the conservation management plan, and ensuring that there's a participatory approach involving all the stakeholders to the heritage sites, bringing them together for managing the site.
Can I just before we continue the conversation, can you hear me? Oh, I have something here. Can I say that captioning, unfortunately, now has to stop. We thank our captioning company. We can continue the webinar, we can continue the conversation, of course, but we do not have budget for continuing captioning. So this is, yeah, please. So Ndukuyaki, you wanted to also respond, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Just 2 quick points, responding to, the question by Lisa. When the issue of, can heritage sites still be managed with their intangible aspects considered without them being World Heritage sites per se? I say yes. And in one of my publications, I have argued that we need to make a distinction here because there are different categories of sites. There are those that still continue to have spiritual significance directly attached to them on a regular basis. And we need to manage those differently from sites that may no longer have such significance attached by living societies. But equally, we need to also accept that as part of ongoing change of events, some sites are acquiring significance that may not have been there yesterday. Simply because those who are new in the landscape are linking up with that particular site for their own purposes, which might not be what we interpret from a research point of view. So I definitely agree that we need to make a distinction and manage those sites accordingly. But I also want to say as an example of sites that have provided some benefit, to societies nearby. I want to give an example of, what we did at the Johannesburg, some many years ago when I was stationed there. We were of the strong view that people should, have financial power before anything, and what we did was to work with community members who were active in various forms of craft. And as a manager of that center, I got them to come and actually be stationed at the center during office hours, so that people who are coming there as tourists can actually see these people actively working on their craft. And some of the tourists will be so eager that they will wait for a particular artwork to be finished, and then they buy it on the spot and say, I can relate with this particular art because either I laid a hand or I washed it to completion. So what that did was that the man-to-man turnover of those specific craft workers actually increased. and they were able to not be given money on a day-to-day basis, because our view was that if you get this money, we are promoting a hand-to-mouth approach, and therefore they needed to be given this money at intervals so that they are then able to do a far more in their household than they would if they sold just one specific item. But I must also highlight here that it was an issue of lack of education. I'm talking about Western education here, whereby some of these were old women who were still speaking in a pound language. I mean, South Africa only moved from a pound, British pound, in 1961 to use our South African rand. But those who are familiar with South Africa will know that our grandmothers still talk of money in a pound language, and they will tell you how many pounds this is going to cost. And unless you know how to calculate that into rands on a 1-to-1, 1-to-2 basis, you will not be able to tell how much money it is. So their grandchildren were actually writing wrong prices, which led to the sales dropping, because someone will be shocked and say, why would this cost so much money? I'm being ripped off here and not buy. Now, lastly, my point is, has anyone, and there's only 2 South Africans here, being myself and Dr. Rotling, but so only 2 of us may better appreciate the point I'm about to make. But those who are also familiar with South African heritage will be exposed to the argument. All our World Heritage Sites in South Africa are managed by a specific government department. And specifically, that's a department of, I'm going to call it Environmental Affairs. I know they've just changed their name to the Department of Fisheries, Environment, and so on. But let's, for argument's sake, call them Department of Foreign Affairs. Has anyone wondered why must it be specifically this department that looks after our World Heritage? And my argument is, it is because this department is basically tasked with managing protected areas, right? And if we look at all our World Heritage sites, there are no people living within them, unlike in other African countries. These are managed as protected areas where, in a way, no one is supposed to live there except the staff members. So even that by itself distances, people, and the living heritage aspects are therefore dealt a big blow. And when people want to access some of their graves, inside these World Heritage sites, they are told they must do so within the legal principles that are Eurocentric and highly Westernized. Otherwise, they will not be given permission. So these are problems that we are faced with, which deepen inequality amongst our societies. Thank you.
It makes me a little bit sad listening to this, because it's just, yeah, we need to change things. I don't know, there is still a question also from the audience. I don't know if they are still there, but we can maybe address the question. There are 2 actually, I don't know, because there is one that was answered by a few people, by Folashade already by typing, but maybe other people want to respond, which is Patricia O'Donnell asking, are there examples that speakers can bring forward that are designated locally or by the national authorities that is a positive benefit for the community? And I think it's already a little bit addressed and throughout, but if there are specific examples, maybe for Patricia, then you can bring them up. And then there are, in the meantime, another question arrived. Sorry, I didn't even see this. 2 more questions in the Q&A. Rusudan says, thank you to all the speakers for the great presentations. I'm just reading them because I am not sure if everyone is able to read them. It seems to me from these presentations that the issue is not heritage, but more the system in which it's nurtured. Do you think that heritage professionals should engage more in the political discourse to have the political aspects of heritage better heard? And before doing so, better identify own ideological and political platform from which heritage is promoted? I have many thoughts on this, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, maybe just to, well, try to wrap up these two questions. And there was also a question, I think, coming from a student of heritage studies asking, should we, continue learning within this? Should we infiltrate from within or try to find another ways? Well, I think firstly, we can't separate heritage from politics. That's, I think, was so clearly stated in all of our presentations and throughout the discussion, and not only national politics, but really these global politics that we are all kind of ingrained with. We can't not recognize that there are so many kind of levels of inequalities working out there, not only in terms of what kind of voices are represented or who can earn from something, but really how much the educational system and institutional systems are already preparing people for this relationship of you as an expert coming somewhere and just delivering certain message or thing. So I think it definitely goes so much deeper. So we need to be politically active, politically aware. We need to know where we stand in terms of our own ideological and political standpoints and then beliefs. I think when it comes to me, that's definitely not kind of infiltration into the World Heritage system and UNESCO, because I think the systems that have been for so long created based on inequalities are really not the first ones to look at or change when when you desire a change, a radical change. But I think at the same time, it's like when you are invited sometimes to do something, that means really trying to push these boundaries, trying to at least bring some sort of discomfort in this kind of very comfortable space of World Heritage power centers. For me personally, there's been a lot of initiatives that I've been following and helping that are really not related even to local or national governments, but really to people self-organizing in order to connect heritage with different political struggles. And there's currently going on really inspirational examples in southeast of Serbia, for example, which is called Let's Protect the Rivers of Old Mountain. The movement started as a campaign against the mini hydroelectric pumps that would ruin the rivers. But really within that, there was such a kind of recognition and valorization of what these rivers means to local population, what kind of life they mean, how they're ingrained within the culture and the very existence of these places. And now there's a whole lot of kind of heritage initiatives, you could say, around it, including the collection of different oral stories, different tours, the small community museum being made there. So it's an example in which heritage is basically kind of goes hand in hand with these struggles. There's also a lot of others throughout the world that are really trying to bring these kind of queer, feminist, homelessness as an issue, that try to really not work only on the content differently, but find different methods for addressing heritage and relationship with the past and different relations with different stakeholders. So I think that's really things to look at, to be inspired by, and then to advocate for changes sometimes also within when we have a chance.
Anyone who wants to respond to this still? Because we also have one more question, which could be a really good question to end on, maybe. Which is again from the audience. Micah says, thank you so much for the speakers. My question would be, what is the message to civil society? So I mean the people, the communities, the in and out of the site. So rather than to the policymakers and the people in the offices, what can we yeah, what can we give, or what is the message to people who live there, and maybe engage with it in those ways.
I would say everyone should be sensitized about the value of each heritage site, and everyone should play their own part in ensuring that the heritage is preserved. We all have a part to play. Fine, for Nigeria, Westernization has whittled down the consciousness about heritage, because now that many people have embraced the Western religion, we have done away with attaching or identifying with the values of our heritage. Many people would no longer want their children or themselves to be given names that relate to the traditional worship. But the issue is, if we do not continue to preserve what we have, if we don't value what we have, there are situations where we have come to a point where it is the Westerners that value our heritage in Africa more than the way we see these things. Just like the scenario, the example I gave of the youths in Lagos State desecrating the palace of the Oba as a way of punishing the Oba. No, I don't see how the two relate. They destroyed several palaces, destroyed the magistrate courts, destroyed many historic sites just because they were annoyed with the government. You are destroying your own heritage, your own identity, and you are saying you are fighting the government. It shows that the cultural conscience has been destroyed, and we need to sensitize the youth about the value of heritage, because the sites that we have, the World Heritage Site that I said, still operating as living heritage, we find out that even though we do not have laws in place to protect those sites, because the law is archaic or borders more on tangible heritage, but we can say that the taboos are what is still keeping those sites, the integrity of those sites. So we need to do more in sensitizing the younger generation about the value of heritage, so that the heritage can be preserved for posterity.
Okay, you want to respond?
I just wanted to add to that, because the taboos she's talking about is very important, and that is what has been omitted when we inscribe heritage sites. We do not have a section that covers traditional, ways of custodianship, which includes taboos. It's intangible, but it's also part of the tangible. And if we continue to separate the two, of course, we're going to lose the youth, because it's no longer the nostalgia. You've taken that out of you've taken the intangible out of the tangible. So the youths are no longer connected to source. And source is what keeps the tangible heritage. Yeah.
Maybe just quickly, kind of to answer that question, what is the message to civil society, or however you call yourself outside of these kind of dominant power structures? Like, think critically about those structures that are already in place, to be brave and creative and loud and disrupt them when needed, to not allow to be sensitized to the current ways of doing heritage, I would say, but really search for other ways, either in the past or in the future, or within the very relationships that you have within your community, and hold accountable all those people that sit in offices, I think, because ultimately they're there for all of us, not for keeping these power structures. So I think it's this role of citizens, of communities, of civil societies in being much more loud, much more kind of out there is really crucial.
Sorry.
All three at the same time. I think Winnie was first, and then Ndukiyaki, and then Sophia.
My concluding thought is that for civil society, for local communities, is for us to see structures such as the World Heritage Convention as a resource, not necessarily as a solution to our problems, but as a resource to use to either strengthen the positive aspects of our own structures or to dismantle these oppressive systems that we currently are faced with. And I think a lot of us, especially in developing countries, we see these international conventions, these international structures as coming in as being the messiah, you know, that is coming to solve all our problems. But what we need to do is to see how we can utilize those structures to make sure that we stabilize our own internal resources for our own benefits as a people. And also, I think Afola Sade spoke about, you know, and Dr. Ndlovu also spoke about, you know, lack of engagement, lack of education of the local communities of civil society. And once the civil society gets engaged, you know, with the will to change what the social ills that we have, that is when we will see change. But let us not view these international structures as our messiah, as our holy grail for solving our inherent institutional problems that we have, especially in a country like South Africa. Let us use these structures to see how we can dismantle these unequal power relations, to see how we can utilize them to get the outcomes that we want, especially when it comes to us owning our heritage.
Thank you. Just 3 quick points for me. The first one is we have this concept of saying we are managing heritage for future generations. In the paper published early this year, I asked a question: has the future generation been born yet? And the reason I'm asking that specific question is we've got some heritage sites that have not been accessible to citizens because they are supposedly of significant importance, and therefore they should be managed for future generations. So when you look at French rocker sites that have been closed, from the 1970s, or some even earlier, I'm asking myself, am I not the future generation they were talking about, over 50 years ago? If I am not, which is that generation and when is it going to come so that they can access the sites and engage with? So when we don't allow people access to the sites, we actually distance people from these sites because we are monumentalizing them. Now, I've also argued that the monumentalization of heritage is not an African approach, to heritage management, and yet this is what has been enforced, to us ideologically, and therefore explains why, in the case of South Africa, again, as a South African, and I'm more familiar with the case studies here, it explains why you see some of the monuments that were built after 1994, and these are monuments that are very much linked to liberation, and yet the same victims of apartheid may be blamed for not helping to manage them, because they are not taking good care of them. But is this how Africans approach heritage management, to monumentalize something and put up a fence around them? And as a practical example, I want to use a Guguletu 7 monument. It's in Cape Town, and I'm thinking most of you are familiar with Cape Town. Now, what happened is that these 7 gentlemen were part of the liberation, efforts, and they succumbed to death because of the military power, the then South African government had. Now, these are people who came from within that specific township. And after 94, the government of the day built a monument to honor these people. So when I went there, I think it was in 2007, I found the monument in an unacceptable condition. It was very dirty, people didn't care about it and so on. And these were people from within that community, not somebody who comes from anywhere else, but these were people from within the community. And the question could be, why were they not taking care of something so important to them? But it's purely because the approach to heritage management not make them relate. Therefore, I wondered, Dr. Adewumi, when you were speaking and you were showing photos of the youth helping to destroy, the palace, I wondered whether it was not because, as you have in South Africa, people have been distanced, from these sites in the name of protecting them, but also because, we are protecting them for future generations, which is not necessarily them, or will it be their grandchildren? Because when that time comes, we'll still be singing the same song. We are managing them for future generation that is yet to be born. Thank you.
What you just said, moving at the process for nominating heritage sites as national monuments before was through executive fiat, which, like what you said, will exclude the people who were taking care of these sites from continuing with what they were doing. But now, since we have realized that those monuments that were declared as national monuments, many of them have become, they have come to a state of disrepair because the people who were taking care of them before have neglected them for the government. Immediately they were declared as monuments. But now we have moved towards a participatory approach where before we even declare them as monuments, we discuss with the government, with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, will carry along the custodians of this heritage, interact with them, discuss with them. So even many of our heritage sites now have conservation management plans. And some of them that have gone into disrepair after being declared as national monuments, the Commission for Museums and Monuments, because of the knowledge they have now about the participatory management system approach, they have started relating with the community, enlightening them about the value of the heritage and then protect these monuments. That is one of the things, one of the benefits we have learned from the approach found in the World Heritage Convention.
I think we can continue forever with this conversation, but and that would be great, actually. I would very much like to continue talking, but I feel also like maybe I should let you go because it's quite late and you might be hungry, or maybe you need a break just because, we've been going for a long time. So I don't know if there is some very last message someone has. I'm happy to give you still the floor. Otherwise, I'm going to quickly share my screen to, let me show this. Come on. To say that we still have 2 more days of super interesting speakers to come next week. This is organized by Toki. And a whole team, of course, but yeah. And you can still register. I will put the link in the chat also for people who are interested. This is, yeah, so this is still coming and we are continuing the conversation. Then just to really thank all the speakers of today. That was really interesting. Also, thank you, Toki and Sophia, for joining the conversation. And I just hope that maybe at some point in the future, we can continue this conversation and hear more from all your incredibly important and interesting work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure.